H1. Why are humans the only species forbidden from carrying weapons in galactic assemblies? H2. Part 1. The rule nobody talks about. The station was the size of a small moon. Aaron Cole pressed his face close to the glass of the transit pod and stared at it. He had seen pictures before, of course. Everyone on Earth had seen pictures of Station Vereth 9. It was one of those images that showed up in school textbooks and news feeds and government presentations about why humanity's entry into the Galactic Assembly was the greatest moment in human history. But pictures did not do it any justice at all. The station floated in the dark between 3 star systems, and it glowed with a cold silver light that made it look less like something built and more like something that had simply always existed. Aaron was 34 years old. He had worked in the Earth Diplomatic Corps for 9 years. He had negotiated trade agreements with 2 alien species, survived a 6-month posting on a Vrethian deep space platform where the temperature was kept at a level that made his fingers go numb every morning, and once talked his way out of a border violation charge by calmly explaining the concept of a GPS error to a Dorak customs officer for 2 hours. He was not easily impressed. He was, at this particular moment, very impressed. "Close your mouth," said Laura Finch from the seat beside him. She was 29, sharp-eyed, and had a habit of reading 4 things at once on her datapad, while somehow still noticing everything happening around her. She was Aaron's aide, and she was better at her job than most senior diplomats Aaron had ever met. "You look like someone who has never seen a space station before." "I have never seen a space station this big before," Aaron said, without moving away from the glass. "You have 3 hours before the welcome session. Use the time to look less amazed and more authoritative." Aaron smiled and sat back in his seat. Outside, the station grew larger as the pod moved toward the docking bay. Ships from a dozen different species were coming and going around it, each one a different shape, a different size, a different color. One of them, long and dark and perfectly smooth, was larger than anything humanity had yet managed to build. Aaron watched it drift past the window like a slow shadow. He had been sent to Vereth 9 to represent Earth at the Assembly's annual session. 7 weeks of diplomatic talks, trade negotiations, species rights discussions, and the kind of slow, careful work that most people back home never heard about, but that quietly shaped the galaxy around them. It was an honor. It was also, Aaron knew, a test. Earth was still new to all of this. 63 years of membership was nothing compared to the thousands of years some of these species had been sitting at the same table. The pod docked with a soft, pressurized hiss. Aaron picked up his bag, straightened his jacket, and followed Laura down the exit ramp into the receiving corridor of Station Vereth 9. The first thing he noticed was how many different kinds of beings were moving through the corridor. Vrethians, tall and silver-skinned, moving with the smooth, unhurried grace of a species that had been doing this for centuries. A group of Son Collective members, small and softly glowing, drifting close together in a quiet cluster. 2 Dorak soldiers, standing at a checkpoint, their ceremonial war axes mounted on their backs, their forearms folded in the formal resting position. Aaron had read about all of these species. He had studied their customs, their languages, their diplomatic protocols. Still, seeing them in person was something else. A Vrethian official approached him before he had taken 20 steps. The official was tall, even by Vrethian standards, with the long tapered fingers and the slow blinking 4 eyes that marked his species. He wore the pale gray uniform of an assembly coordinator, and he was carrying a datapad which he held out to Aaron with both hands in the formal greeting style. "Delegate Cole," the official said. His translator bead rendered the words in clean, accented English. "Welcome to Station Vereth 9. I am Coordinator Saul. I will be your point of contact for the duration of the session." "Thank you, Coordinator," Aaron said, and took the datapad. He expected it to be the standard arrival packet. Room assignments, session schedules, dining protocols for human physiology, The usual. It was not the usual. The datapad showed a single document. It was short, it was very clearly formatted, and it had been highlighted in the deep orange color that Aaron knew from his training meant mandatory compliance. Regulation 7 Gamma of the Galactic Assembly Code of Conduct read as follows. Human delegates and all human personnel are prohibited from carrying any weapon, tool with a cutting edge, projectile device, impact instrument, or any object that could be reasonably adapted for use as a weapon within the boundaries of any Galactic Assembly facility during any assembly session or related event. Aaron read it once, then he read it again. Then he looked up at Coordinator Saul, whose 4 eyes were all blinking at different speeds, which Aaron had learned was the Vrethian equivalent of visible discomfort. This applies only to humans, Aaron said. It was not a question. That is correct, Delegate Cole. Every other species has an exemption for ceremonial weapons. That is also correct. The Dorak carry war axes into formal sessions. The Dorak exemption covers traditional ceremonial armaments, yes. The Kedavari walk in with plasma lances. The Kedavari have a cultural exemption, yes. And we cannot carry a pocket knife. There was a pause. Coordinator Saul held very still, in the way that very tall beings sometimes did, when they were hoping that being still would make an awkward situation resolve itself. That is also correct, he said, quietly. Aaron handed the datapad back. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Coordinator Saul with the calm, steady expression of a man who had spent 9 years learning that the first thing you said in a difficult moment was almost always less important than how you said it. I would like to understand the history behind this regulation, Aaron said. Not to challenge it, just to understand it. Can you tell me who I should speak to? Saul took the datapad back and held it carefully with both hands. I can submit a request to the Council of Elders on your behalf, he said. But I should be honest with you, Delegate. This regulation is not something that is often discussed. Why not? Saul blinked all 4 eyes slowly. Because the answer makes a great many very old and very senior species feel something they are not accustomed to feeling. Aaron waited. Uncomfortable, Saul said. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor, leaving Aaron standing with his bag over one shoulder, and Laura Finch at his side, who had been listening to every word and was now looking at her datapad with the focused, quiet expression she always got when she had already decided what she was going to do next. I'll start with the archive records, she said. I was going to suggest that, Aaron replied. I know, she said. That's why I said it first. They walked into the station together, and behind them, the transit pod sealed its doors and pulled away from the dock. And somewhere deep in the ancient filing systems of the oldest diplomatic station in the known galaxy, the answer to Aaron's question was waiting in the dark, patient as a held breath, for someone to finally come and find it. Why are humans the only species forbidden from carrying weapons in galactic assemblies? Part 2. The Archive Beneath the Floor. HR. The archive levels of Station Vareth 9 were not designed with humans in mind. Laura Finch had figured that out within the first 10 minutes of her first visit. The ceilings were too high, which would have been fine, except that the shelving units and data terminals had been built to match the ceiling height, which meant that roughly a third of the physical storage was above the level she could comfortably reach. The lighting was tuned to a cool, bluish frequency that Vrethian eyes apparently found pleasant, and that gave Laura a mild headache after about an hour. The chairs at the reading terminals were built for beings with a different number of joints in their legs, so she had given up on sitting, and instead stood at the terminal with her own portable unit balanced on the edge of the console and her coffee thermos wedged against the wall. She had been down here for 3 days. She had found a great deal of material that had nothing to do with what she was looking for. She had found session records going back 1100 years. She had found a collection of translated diplomatic correspondence between four species who had not spoken to each other in 6 centuries. She had found a detailed record of a trade dispute over mineral rights that had apparently taken 80 years to resolve and had ended, according to the final entry, with both sides agreeing that the minerals were not actually worth what either of them had originally thought. She had not yet found anything about Regulation 7 Gamma. That was, in itself, interesting. In her experience, the absence of something in a record system was almost always more meaningful than its presence. Records got lost by accident sometimes, yes, but records got hidden on purpose more often than people like to admit. On the morning of the 4th day, she changed her approach. Instead of searching for the regulation itself, she searched for everything filed in the same 60-day window as the date stamped on the regulation. She cross-referenced it with the names of the 7 species listed as co-signatories on the original document, and then narrowed it further by filtering for any file marked with the Assembly's restricted access code. There were 4 results. 3 of them were routine security assessments from that period. Dry, procedural, nothing unusual. The 4th one made her set down her coffee. It was a behavioral analysis document, 42 pages long, filed by the Assembly's Joint Species Research Office 63 years ago. The title was written in formal Vrethian, which her translation matrix rendered as Preliminary Assessment of the Human Species, Observed Behavioral Patterns Under Conditions of Stress, Threat, and Social Pressure. She opened it and began to read. She read for 2 hours without stopping. When she was done, she sat very still for a moment, looking at the far wall of the archive, where a faded diagram of some long-ago station layout had been painted directly onto the metal in the careful, precise style of old Vrethian technical art. Then she picked up her thermos, found that the coffee had gone completely cold, drank it anyway, and sent Aaron a message that said only, "Come down here, bring food. This is going to take a while." Aaron arrived 40 minutes later with 2 protein packs from the human-compatible dispenser on level 6, and the expression of a man who had just spent the morning sitting through a 3-hour welcome ceremony conducted entirely in formal Dvorak. "How was the welcome session?" Laura asked. "Long," Aaron said. "There was a ritual recitation of the founding charter, all 4,000 lines of it." "Did you stay awake?" "Mostly." He sat down beside her terminal, or rather he attempted to sit, and then gave up and leaned against the console instead, which was what most humans ended up doing in the archive-level chairs. Laura turned her screen toward him and let him read. He read slowly and carefully, the way he always did with important documents. Laura watched his face. She had worked with Aaron long enough to know his expressions well. He started with the look he always had when reading something new. Attentive, neutral, processing. About 10 minutes in, something shifted. His eyes slowed down. He went back and reread a section, then another. By the time he reached the final summary page, he was very quiet. "The Haran Empire signed this," he said. "Yes," Laura said. That was the part that had stopped her too. The Haran were humanity's oldest galactic friends. They had been the first species to make peaceful contact with Earth. They had guided humanity through the early years of space travel, shared navigational charts, helped negotiate the first trade agreements, and personally sponsored Earth's application for Assembly membership. On Earth, the Haran were spoken of the way people spoke of a wise and generous older relative. There were Haran cultural centers in 6 major cities. Children learned the Haran greeting in school. And 63 years ago, the Haran Empire had quietly signed a document recommending that humans be permanently disarmed at every galactic diplomatic gathering, without ever telling humanity that they had done so. "They weren't acting against us," Laura said, before Aaron could speak. "Read the Haran section again, page 31. Aaron scrolled back. He read it again. The Haran section was different in tone from the others, where the Vrethians had written in dry clinical language about risk assessment and probability modeling, and where the Dvorak had written in the blunt, formal style of a military evaluation, The Huron section read almost like a personal letter. It described a deep admiration for human resilience. It described what the Huron researchers called the most remarkable social instinct we have encountered in 4,000 years of contact with other species. It described something they had observed again and again in every human interaction they had studied. It described the fact that humans, when someone near them was in danger, did not calculate. They moved. They acted. They reached toward the problem with whatever they had in their hands at that moment, whether that was a weapon, a tool, a piece of furniture, a kind word, or nothing at all. And that, the Huron researchers had written, with what seemed like genuine awe, mixed with genuine worry, was exactly why the weapons ban had been proposed. Not because humans were violent, because humans were, in the language of the document, situationally adaptive in ways that existing security frameworks are not designed to accommodate. In plain words, humans did not follow the rules of a crisis the way every other species did. They invented new rules on the spot, and when they were armed, that quality became something that no security model in the Assembly's long history had ever been able to predict or contain. They were afraid, Aaron said slowly, but not of what we'd start. No, Laura agreed. They were afraid of what we'd do once something else started. Laura pulled up one more file she had found near the bottom of the restricted folder. It was a short incident report, only 2 pages, dated 11 years after Earth's first contact. The name at the top was Philip Warren, trade observer, human, unarmed. She pushed the screen toward Aaron and let him read. He read it slowly. When he finished, he did not say anything for a long moment. Then he looked up at the high ceiling of the archive, with its Vrethian art and its cold blue light, and he let out a slow breath. "We need to request a formal meeting with the Elder Council," he said. "I already submitted the request," Laura said, 20 minutes ago. Aaron looked at her. "You were going to say it," she said simply. "I just said it first." She closed the files, tucked her portable unit under her arm, picked up her empty thermos, and headed for the exit. Aaron followed, and behind them the archive settled back into its quiet dark, and the old files rested in their place. And the story that nobody at the Assembly had wanted to tell for 63 years waited patiently for the moment, now very close, when it would finally be told out loud. Why are humans the only species forbidden from carrying weapons in galactic assemblies? Part 3. What the cameras recorded. The council chamber of the Elder Assembly was not a room built to make anyone feel small. It was, however, a room that made almost everyone feel small anyway. The ceiling was 40 meters above the floor, supported by columns of pale stone that had been quarried from a planet that no longer existed. The walls were lined with the recorded seals of every species that had ever held a seat at the Assembly, going back to the very first gathering, when only 3 species had sat together and agreed, carefully and with great difficulty, that talking was better than the alternative. The floor was a single piece of polished dark material that reflected the light in a way that made it look like walking on still water. Aaron Cole walked to the center of it alone. He had offered to bring Laura, and she had told him that he did not need her in the room for this one. He had the files, he had the questions, and more importantly, she had said, he had the face, the calm, open, genuinely curious expression that tended to make people want to answer him honestly, even when they had planned not to. She would wait outside and read. 7 council members sat at the curved table facing him. They represented the oldest voices in the Assembly, species that had been part of this gathering longer than human civilization had existed in its current form. Aaron recognized each of them from his preparation files. Councillor Orath of the Vrethians, pale and very still, with the slow, careful movements of someone accustomed to speaking in rooms where every word was weighed. Councillor Grouth of the Dorak, enormous and dark, his ceremonial armor worn even here, 2 of his forearms resting on the table and 2 folded behind his back. The San Collective's representative, a softly glowing cluster of small connected beings that moved and spoke as one. 4 others, each representing a species with its own long history and its own particular way of holding silence. You have reviewed the archived documents, Counselor Orath said. It was not a question. I have, Aaron replied. The regulation, the behavioral analysis, and the incident report for the trade observer named Philip Warren. A small shift moved through the council. It was subtle, a slight change in posture here, a brief pause in the San Collective's gentle inner light there. But Aaron had spent 9 years learning to read the body language of species that did not share his biology, and he recognized what he was seeing. They were relieved. They had been waiting a long time for someone to come in here and ask this question properly, and now that it was being asked, they were relieved. We would have told you eventually, said Counselor Grouth. His voice was very deep, and the translator bead rendered it with a gravelly, unhurried quality that matched it well. But there is no good time to tell a species something like this. Something like what exactly? Aaron asked. I'd like to hear it from you directly. Grouth looked at him for a moment with the flat, appraising gaze of a being who had spent 3 centuries evaluating other beings. Then he nodded, slowly, as if making a decision. 64 years ago, Grouth said, before your species had been formally admitted to the Assembly, a human trade observer was present at a session here on this station. His name was Philip Warren. He was not a diplomat. He was not a soldier. He was an economic analyst, here to observe a trade discussion between 2 factions of the Ketavari. He was 26 years old, unarmed, and he had been in space for exactly 4 months. Aaron listened without moving. The session went wrong very quickly, Grouth continued. The 2 Ketavari factions had a dispute that went beyond trade. There was a territorial grievance beneath it that the session had not been designed to address. And when one faction's lead delegate said something that the other faction's lead delegate considered a formal insult to their bloodline, the room changed in about 4 seconds. Grouth paused. 11 plasma lances came out. The 2 factions had positioned people around the room before the session even started, which told us afterward that the violence had been planned. Every other observer in the room did exactly what assembly protocol requires in that situation. They moved to the walls. They activated their personal shields. They waited for security. He leaned forward slightly. Philip Warren did not move to the wall. The chamber was completely quiet. He stood up from his seat. He was holding a water carafe from the refreshment table. He had picked it up at some point during the session, possibly because he was thirsty, possibly for another reason. He later told our investigators he was not sure himself. And he walked toward the Ketavari, slowly, without hurrying, without showing fear in any way that Ketavari biology would recognize as fear. Aaron found that he was holding very still. He talked to them, Grouth said. We have the recording. He talked to both factions, one at a time, back and forth, for 4 minutes and 31 seconds. He told the first faction that their grievance was real, and that he had personally heard worse insults than the one they had just received, and that the fact that they were still standing and talking meant they were already winning. He told the second faction that they had 11 plasma lances and were surrounded by recording equipment, and that the entire assembly would be watching the footage, and that people who fired first in a room full of cameras never ended up looking like the side with the legitimate argument. Grouth's 4 eyes were steady on Aaron's face. And then he poured water into 2 cups from the carafe, and put 1 cup in front of each faction's lead delegate, and sat down in the nearest empty chair, and said, and this is a direct translation, I don't know about you, but I've been in rooms like this before, and it usually goes better when people sit down. A long beat of silence. They put the weapons down, Grouth said. Both factions. They sat down. Philip Warren sat with them for 18 minutes. Until security arrived, and during that time, he apparently talked to both delegations about the water filtration systems on the station, and whether or not the recycled water tasted different from natural water, which was apparently a point of real curiosity to him. Aaron let out a slow breath. Security reviewed the incident for 6 months afterward, Counselor Orath said. Taking over from Grouth, in the smooth, practiced way of beings who had been having difficult conversations together for a long time. And the conclusion they reached was not that Philip Warren was unusually brave. It was that his behavior was, for a human, relatively ordinary. Aaron looked up. We pulled every record we had of human behavior in high-stress situations, Orath continued. Not just in space, not just in diplomatic contexts. We looked at your historical records, your emergency services, your conflict zones, your disaster responses, and we found the same pattern, again and again. He folded his long fingers together on the table. When something goes wrong near a human, the human attempts to fix it with whatever is available, without waiting for the correct authority or the correct tool or the correct protocol. They simply look at the problem and look at what they have in their hands, and they try. Grouth spoke again. We ran models. We asked, what happens if a human delegate is armed during a live security incident? And the models could not give us a consistent answer. Because a human with a weapon in a crisis does not behave like a security officer with a weapon, or a soldier with a weapon, or any category of armed being that our models were built to predict. He looked directly at Aaron. A human with a weapon in a crisis behaves like whatever the crisis needs. And that, Delegate Cole, is the thing that kept 11 of our best security analysts awake at night for 6 months. Not the danger of what you might start, the complete unpredictability of what you might do once something else had already started. Aaron sat with that for a moment. Outside the chamber, somewhere on the station, Laura was reading, and probably already thinking 3 steps ahead. And somewhere in the archive below, the record of Philip Warren and his water carafe sat in its old file, patient and quiet, waiting to mean something more than it already had. I think I understand, Aaron said. Do you? Grouth asked, and the question was genuine. You didn't ban us because you were afraid of us, Aaron said. You banned us because you didn't know what to do with us. Why are humans the only species forbidden from carrying weapons in galactic assemblies? Part 4. The Pattern. The council gave Aaron a break after the first session. He walked out of the chamber into a wide corridor that ran along the outer ring of the station's upper levels, where one full wall was made of clear material and looked directly out into space. He stood there for a while, watching a slow convoy of Vrethian cargo ships move in formation toward the docking bays below. Their running lights blinked in a regular rhythm, patient and steady, the same signal pattern their species had been using for 800 years. Laura appeared at his elbow a few minutes later with 2 cups of something warm from the nearest dispenser. She handed him one without speaking. He took it. They told you about Philip Warren, she said. It was not a question. She had read the incident file herself. Yes, Aaron said. How did it feel, hearing it out loud? Aaron thought about that. Like something I already knew, he said, but didn't know I knew. Laura nodded and looked out at the ships. She understood what he meant. You grew up on Earth reading about people who had done things like that. Not the famous ones, not the ones in history books, but the ordinary ones. The person who stayed in the burning building because there was still someone inside. The one who walked into the argument because it looked like it was getting out of hand. The one who stopped on the side of the road because there was a car that looked like it needed help. You grew up around it so constantly that you stopped seeing it as extraordinary. It was just what people did. Apparently, it was not what most species did. There's more, she said. The council sent me the full research file while you were in the chamber. The archive records I found were just the summary. Aaron looked at her. 47 incidents, she said. In 60 years, human delegates involved in security situations inside assembly facilities. Not as the cause, as the variable. She pulled out her datapad and read, while Aaron listened. The first case she described was a woman named Nina Grant, a junior delegate who had been present at a hostage situation on one of the Assembly's outer platforms 11 years ago. A member of the Rethuvani Communion, a young male who had been radicalized by a land dispute on his homeworld, had taken a senior San collective dignitary and locked himself in a communications room. He was armed. He was frightened. He had made a list of demands that the Assembly security team had assessed as impossible to meet in the time frame he was asking for. Nina Grant had not been part of the response team. She had been walking past the corridor on her way to a different meeting entirely. She had heard the shouting. She had stopped. And then, rather than going to find security, or waiting in a safe room, or doing any of the other 14 things that Assembly protocol recommended for a bystander in a security incident, she had sat down on the floor outside the locked door and started talking through it. She had learned in the first 2 minutes that the Rathuvani male had grown up on a farming settlement. She had grown up near a farming community in the central part of her home country, and she knew something about soil and irrigation and a specific kind of exhausting work that came with trying to grow things in difficult ground. She talked to him about it, gently, without any urgency, without ever suggesting that she was trying to talk him down, because she was not trying to talk him down. She was just talking to him. 90 minutes later, he opened the door and walked out, and Nina Grant was still sitting on the floor, and he was crying, and she gave him a folded piece of paper with her contact information on it, because she had told him she would look into the land dispute, and she meant it. He had written to her. The land dispute had eventually been resolved through a process that Nina had helped to initiate through back channels. And it had taken 3 years, but it had worked. The second case was a man named Owen Park, a mid-level trade delegate, who had been standing 6 meters away when an assassination attempt was made against a senior San collective dignitary during a reception event. The attacker was a Vrethian youth who had obtained a short-range energy weapon through means that security was still investigating. He had raised it. He had aimed it. Owen Park had stepped between them. He had not done it after careful thought. He had not calculated the odds. The investigators who reviewed the footage afterward could see very clearly that Owen Park had not hesitated at all. There was not a single frame of the recording that showed him pausing or deciding. He had simply been standing 6 meters away, and then he had been standing between the weapon and the dignitary, and the time between those two states was less than 2 seconds. The attacker had frozen. Witnesses described the expression on Owen Park's face during the 3 seconds before security arrived as something they struggled to name. It was not rage. It was not heroic determination. Several witnesses independently used the same word. Disappointed. He had looked at the young Vrethian with an expression of mild, quiet disappointment, the way a person looked at someone who had just done something they were pretty sure the person was going to regret. The young attacker had lowered his weapon. He had not done it because of the disappointment exactly. He had done it because Owen Park was an unarmed being standing in the way and looking at him like he was expected to make a better choice. And something about that, something about the complete absence of fear in a situation designed to produce fear, had simply stopped him. Security had arrived. Owen Park had stepped aside and straightened his jacket. When asked by investigators why he had done what he did, he had said, after a short pause, that it had seemed like the nearest thing to do. Laura read 3 more cases. A man named Carl Briggs, who had diffused a pressure valve failure in a diplomatic transport with a piece of his own luggage and a tool he had made from 2 components of the transport's interior lighting. A woman named Diane Russo, who had spent 40 minutes translating an argument between 2 Dorok junior delegates who were about to come to physical blows, not because she spoke Dorok, she did not, but because she had recognized that the argument was not really about the thing they were arguing about. And she had been right, and both delegates had eventually confirmed that she had correctly identified a grief that neither of them had known how to name. A teenage boy named Kevin Torres, the son of a delegate, who had been present during a medical emergency involving a pale architect visitor and had calmly performed a pressure technique he had learned from an old human first aid guide. Not because it was the correct pale architect medical technique, it was not, but because it was close enough and he had tried it and it had worked. Each case had been reviewed. Each case had been modeled. Each case had been added to a growing file that the Assembly's security division kept updated, and that no one, in 60 years, had ever shown to a human delegate. Aaron listened to all of it without interrupting. By the time Laura finished, they had both been standing at the window for nearly an hour, and the Vrethian cargo convoy had long since moved out of sight, replaced by a slow rotation of smaller ships coming in from the outer systems. They modeled what would happen if we were armed, Aaron said. Yes, in every one of those scenarios, and in hundreds of simulated ones. And the models couldn't predict the outcome. Not reliably, not within acceptable margins. In some scenarios, the human delegate resolved the situation faster with a weapon available. In others, the outcome was worse. But the thing that appeared in almost every model, the thing the analysts kept returning to, was not the outcome, it was the path. She turned to look at him. Every other species, when something goes wrong, follows a recognizable path. They escalate or they de-escalate. They move toward safety or they move toward confrontation. The security teams can prepare for it. But humans invent a third option, Aaron said quietly. Or a fourth. Or something that doesn't have a name. Something that the situation specifically required, and that no one had thought of before. Aaron was quiet for a moment. And a human with a weapon, doing that, in the middle of a live crisis inside a diplomatic facility, containing 30 species and 4,000 years of agreements, was the thing that kept the security analysts awake, Laura finished. Yes. Aaron looked back out at the dark. Somewhere out there on a small warm planet far from this station, people were going about their day, and helping strangers on the side of the road, and sitting on the floor outside locked doors, talking to frightened people about farming, and stepping in front of things because it seemed like the nearest thing to do. Okay, he said after a while. Okay? Laura looked at him. I know what I'm going to say to the council, he said. She studied his face for a moment, then she nodded slowly. I was wondering when you'd get there, she said. Did you figure it out before me? She thought about it honestly. About 40 minutes ago, she said. He almost smiled. Then you have a head start on the wording. I already have a draft, she said, and held up her datapad. He shook his head once, but the expression on his face was not annoyance. It was something much closer to pride. They turned together and walked back toward the council chamber, and outside the window behind them, the stars kept their long, patient watch over a galaxy that was still, very slowly, learning what to make of the species that had arrived 63 years ago and had not once, in all that time, stayed behind a blast shield when someone outside it needed help. H1. Why are humans the only species forbidden from carrying weapons in galactic assemblies? H2. Part 5. What gets written into the record? Aaron Cole requested 48 hours before giving his formal response to the council. Councillor Orath granted it without hesitation, which told Aaron something. A council that was prepared to defend the regulation would have wanted to move quickly, to keep the conversation on their terms. The fact that Orath had said yes immediately, without consulting the others, without even a pause, told Aaron that what the council actually wanted was time. Time to sit with the fact that the conversation had finally happened, that the secret they had been quietly keeping for 63 years had been found and read and understood, and that the human on the other side of the table had not shouted or demanded or threatened. He had just asked to understand. Aaron spent the first day walking the station, not reviewing files, not preparing arguments, not running his proposal through legal frameworks, just walking. He went through the market corridors where the station's permanent residents, the traders and technicians and administrative staff who kept Vareth 9 running, moved through their days in the comfortable, familiar rhythm of people who had lived somewhere long enough to stop noticing how extraordinary it was. He went through the observation decks. He went through the gardens, which were technically called environmental adjustment spaces, and which every species on the station quietly referred to as gardens, because that was what they were, full of plants and soft light and the particular kind of quiet that living things created around themselves. He sat in the human section of the gardens for a while, where someone had planted actual grass, and where 2 small trees grew in containers, and looked perfectly healthy, considering they were 40 light-years from the nearest natural soil. A young man was sitting near the trees, reading something on a small data pad. He was part of the delegation's administrative support team, barely 20 years old, sent to Varith 9 for his first off-world posting. He looked like someone who had been somewhere new long enough to have found the good spots. Aaron sat nearby and did not disturb him. He thought about Philip Warren, 26 years old, 4 months in space, walking toward 11 plasma lances with a water carafe. He thought about Nina Grant, sitting on the floor of a corridor, talking about soil. He thought about Owen Park, standing in the way with a disappointed expression. He thought about Carl Briggs, and Diane Russo, and Kevin Torres, and the 47 cases in the file, and all the cases that had probably never made it into any file at all. The small ones, the everyday ones, the moments on this station and others, where a human had simply noticed something was wrong and tried to fix it. He thought about what Counselor Grouth had said. A human with a weapon in a crisis behaves like whatever the crisis needs. He turned it over in his mind for a long time. Then he walked back to his rooms, sat down with Laura's draft, and they worked on the proposal together until the early hours of the station's artificial night cycle. The second day he spent preparing, not preparing arguments. He had decided he was not going to argue. The regulation was 63 years old, and it had been put in place by beings who had good reasons, and who had not been wrong exactly. They had seen something real. They had made a decision based on what they saw. Aaron was not here to tell them they had been wrong. He was here to tell them what to do with what they had seen. He walked into the council chamber on the third day, with Laura's finalized draft in his hand, and the calm, open expression that she had told him was his most effective tool in any room. The 7 council members were waiting. Counselor Grouth's 4 eyes tracked Aaron from the moment he entered. Counselor Orath's fingers were folded on the table in the formal listening position. The Son Collective's inner light moved in the quiet, attentive pattern that meant full focus. Aaron placed the draft on the table and did not pick it up again. "I am not here to challenge Regulation 7 Gamma," he said. He let that settle for a moment. He saw Orath's fingers shift, just slightly. That had not been expected. The regulation exists because the Assembly observed something real about humanity and responded to it. The observation was accurate. The response was reasonable given the tools available at the time. I am not going to stand here and tell you that 63 years of Assembly security decisions were wrong. He looked at each council member in turn. But I think we can do better than a rule that treats an honest quality as a liability. He picked up the draft and began to speak. The proposal was simple. It had to be simple. Complicated proposals in diplomatic settings died in the details, and Aaron had learned that lesson early and well. The proposal acknowledged the weapons regulation in full, and did not ask for it to be removed or revised. Instead, it added a single amendment, 1 clause, 1 new piece of language that would sit alongside the regulation in the Assembly Code. Human delegates, while prohibited from carrying weapons under Regulation 7 Gamma, were to be formally designated as Assembly mediators of last resort. The designation meant one specific thing. In any live security incident within an Assembly facility, where standard security protocol had failed, or been unable to contain the situation, a human delegate present on the scene was authorized to act on their own judgment. The Assembly's security force was required to hold their intervention for 90 seconds from the moment a human delegate engaged with the situation, unless the human delegate was in direct physical danger. 90 seconds. Aaron had chosen that number carefully. It was long enough to matter, short enough to feel safe, long enough for a person to sit down in front of a locked door and start talking, long enough for someone to step in front of something and give the person holding the weapon a moment to look at an unarmed being and make a choice. He finished presenting the proposal and waited. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then, Counselor Grouth, who had fought in 3 interstellar wars, and who had once described diplomacy as combat with better vocabulary, leaned forward in his seat. "You are asking us to recognize the thing we were afraid of," Growth said. "I am asking you to recognize it as an asset rather than a risk," Aaron said. "Yes." Growth was quiet for a moment. His 4 eyes moved slowly across Aaron's face, in the way that Dvorak used when they were making a final assessment. "Philip Warren would have voted for this," Growth said. "I believe so," Aaron replied. Growth looked at Orath. Something passed between them, not words, just a long look between two beings who had been sitting in the same room, making difficult decisions together for a very long time. "Call the vote," Growth said. The vote was cast, not after hours of debate, not after a committee review or a draft revision or the months-long process that most assembly amendments required. The vote was cast in the same session, and it passed unanimously, 39 species in favor, none opposed, none abstaining. Laura received the official record notification in the corridor outside. She read it twice. Then she walked to the archive level, went back to the same terminal she had been using for the past week, and added one final entry to the Philip Warren incident file, now for the first time, cross-referenced as the founding precedent for the new amendment. She stood back and read what she had written, and decided it was accurate and correct and exactly right. When she came back up to the main level, Aaron was standing near the corridor window again, looking out at the stars. She stood beside him, and they were both quiet for a moment, in the way that people were quiet after something large had finished. "How long do you think it will take for the news to reach Earth?" Aaron asked. "The official transmission is going out tonight," Laura said. 72 hours, probably. They will have questions. They will have a great many questions. "Good," Aaron said. Outside the window, the stars were the same stars they had always been, old and bright, and scattered across a darkness so large that the distances between them were almost not real numbers, more like poetry. But somewhere out in that dark, around some of those stars, were planets that had not yet joined the assembly. Species that were still in their early years of space travel, still learning the shape of the galaxy they lived in, still figuring out who else was out there and what those others were like. Somewhere out there, one day, a ship from one of those planets would dock at a station like this one, and the beings aboard would step out into the corridors, nervous and curious, and trying to look more confident than they felt. And they would find the galaxy waiting for them. And somewhere on the station, there would be a human who had already noticed they looked nervous, and had already thought of something to say, and was already walking toward them. Aaron watched the stars for another minute. Then he picked up his bag, and Laura picked up her datapad, and they walked together down the corridor toward the evening session, where 39 species were waiting, and the work was never quite finished, but always, always worth doing. Behind them, in the archive below, the old records rested in the dark. Philip Warren and his water carafe, Nina Grant and her soil conversation, Owen Park and his disappointed expression. All of them filed now under a new heading, a new reference, a new meaning. The record had been updated. The story was not over. It was, in fact, just getting started.